Hello, my name is Miss Kayla, the Children's Librarian at the Dubuque County Library District, and this is Story Starters. Every week I get on to read a chapter or two from a different children's book, usually geared towards second through fifth grade. So this week I have a newer release with me. It is The Magnificent Monsters of Cedar Street by Lauren Oliver. So I'll read the first chapter or so. You can settle in at home and listen. Chapter 1. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Cordelia. Dr. Cornelius Clay spun around, and the lantern attached to his forehead bobbled slightly. In his oversized goggles, which were misted slightly from the drizzle, Cordelia thought he very closely resembled the species Cavonicus poison, otherwise known as the lionfish, a monster Cordelia had only ever seen in illustrated form on page 432 of A Guide to Monsters and Their Habits, Cordelia's favorite book. Cornelius's eyes darted nervously behind her. He had been anxious all night. "What have I told you about wearing your mother's boots? I can hear you coming from a mile away." "Sorry." Cordelia wrestled the boot off her right foot and, balancing on one leg, allowed the moisture to drip out of its toe. She shoved her sodden sock back in the boot and wiggled her toes experimentally. Better. Blue Hills Park looked very different at night than it did during the day. During the day, hikers huffed red-faced in the cold along winding hiking trails. Children hunted the marshes for frogs, losing the occasional mitten, and even boot, to the sucking mud along the estuary. And fishermen returned again and again to the same fishing holes, breaking through the morning ice to drop their lines. It was a beautiful place, crowded with dogwood trees and ladies' slippers, herds of white-tailed deer, copperhead snakes. But during the day, even the wildness seemed tame, almost deliberate, as if it had been made specially for the enjoyment of its visitors. The hills and woods, the marshes and the ribbon of stream that fed them, all of them had been named, surveyed, and bounded, and their outlines appended to new maps of the greater Boston area. Tamed and flattened, like a dead butterfly pinned beneath glass, and now property of the newly formed Metropolitan Park Commission. But at night, Blue Hills wasn't a park at all. It was a vast, strange, wild thing, alive with insects and movement. It watched Cordelia and her father with yellow eyes, winking in the grass. It tracked them by their echoes, bouncing news of their progress to great geometries of bats that passed back and forth overhead. It swept in on gusts of wind and touched their necks to make them shiver. It carried news of their skin into 1,000 different corners, whispering warnings of intruders. At night, it was very obvious. They belonged to Blue Hills, not the other way around. At the beginning of the steep pathway that wound up and through the hills, Cordelia's father stopped. He squatted, his lantern swinging slightly, and brushed his fingers to the damp grass. Then he straightened up. "Look, Cordelia." He extended his hand to her. His fingers were streaked with black. "Ash," Cordelia whispered. Her father nodded solemnly. "We must be on the right track." Rector Cushing's wife, Mary Cushing, was the first person to have spotted a fire. On an evening stroll with her husband, a rhododendron bush had, quite without explanation, burst into hardy flames, nearly frightening her out of her skin. For several days afterwards, There had been a steady stream of visitors to the spot, claiming to see in the blackened husk of the bush various saints and spirits. Her husband had even declared that portion of Blue Hills Park sacred ground, and Mrs. Cushing had enjoyed several days of fame, though many accused her of being overly imaginative, and the minister of the rival church, Dr. Buchanan, had even suggested that witchcraft was involved. Then Miss Finch, who worked as a school teacher, and whom no one would ever accuse of having an imagination, had spotted another bush, this time an ugly prickler, go up in flames. This had provoked a roaring debate. Was Blue Hills haunted? Was it blessed? Was it cursed and harboring demons? Were the events, as the scientific community declared, merely a product of a bizarre chemical reaction stemming from various alkaloid concentrations in the soil? Only Cordelia and her father knew the truth. The fires had a different cause altogether, an injured and very possibly dying dragon. "We must go carefully out from here on out," her father whispered, selecting a pair of dingle clips, like handcuffs, but with flexible openings, meant for restraining dragon wings without injuring their delicate membranes, from his rucksack. After slight hesitation, he switched them out for a slightly larger pair. "The fire sites suggest that the dragon is mobile, though of course it can't have the use of its wings, otherwise it would have retreated at the first sign of humans. I know." Cordelia's palms were sweating. 5 years earlier, when she was just 7 years old, she and her father had once treated a dragon, Digbert, as they had come to name him, an ancient withered creature, roughly the size of a couch, whom they had found after locals complained of mysterious bonfires on the beach. His eyes had been clouded by cataracts so solid he could no longer navigate, and even the eye drops Cordelia's father had prepared, a special tincture of chicken blood and crushed lily pads, had done little to help. They could do nothing but keep Digbert in the living room and make sure he was comfortable until the end. The rug and sofas still bore large singed holes as proof of his existence. Patching them would have simply been too sad. Digbert had been one of Cordelia's favorites. He loved to be tickled on the chin, where several silvery whiskers had grown, and to be stroked on the leathery, soft joint behind his wings. When she came in from the moors, with her fingers crooked from cold, he used to warm her hands by exhaling on them. But not all dragons, she knew, were so gentle. They moved up the narrow dirt pathway. This was where Cordelia was happiest, in the deepest, blackest portion of the night, under a great sweep of stars and a rolling fog, like the touch of velvet, walking with her father while the rest of the world was asleep. Out here, she didn't have to think about Sean O'Malley, who hurled stones at her whenever she passed, and had started the rumor that Cordelia and her father were vampires, or Elizabeth Perkins, who giggled behind one gloved hand when she spotted Cordelia in the street and whispered "freak" when Cordelia passed. She didn't have to think about hard times and the money dwindling in the pantry and the marchers in the streets. Then her father spoiled it. "I heard about your scuffle with Henry Haddock," he said, and Cordelia's heart plunged into her boots. She'd been sure when her father had said nothing after Cordelia came home with a scraped knee and a swollen cheek that she had would somehow avoid getting into trouble for her latest fight. "He told everyone that you were bonkers," she said. "He told everyone that we keep locked rooms full of eyeballs." Henry Haddock had said plenty more besides that over the years. That was not why Cordelia had punched him. Just thinking about what had really happened made her skin tighten with rage, her fist throb as if she wanted to punch him again. That's no excuse, her father said. The boy had an eye as swollen as a tomato. He was terrorized. He deserved it, she muttered, shoving her hands into her pockets. Dr. Clay kneeled so that he was face to face with Cordelia. The lantern lit up the crags and hollows of his cheeks and the web of lines around his eyes. Cordelia experienced a sudden shock. Her father was growing old. I know things aren't always easy for you, he said quietly. I blame myself for that. If you hadn't grown up among so many monsters. I love the monsters, she interjected. He smiled, but his smile didn't reach all the way to his eyes, and once again Cordelia had the impression that he was anxious about something. Oh, I know you do, he said. When he was very serious, the Scottish accent that had trailed him all the way from Glasgow grew warmer and richer, rolling his vowels and consonants together. But people can be cruel. They're afraid of what they don't understand. He put two fingers under Cordelia's chin. You're too old to be brawling in the street at St. George's. I'm not going to St. George's, Cordelia said, for what felt like the 100th time. Even the mention of St. George's filled her with a vague panic, an image of coffin-like rooms and 1,000 girls, all of them as cruel as Elizabeth Perkins, all of them laughing at her. Her father shook his head, but he let the subject drop. You have to learn to control your temper, Cordelia. That's part of growing up. Maybe I don't want to grow up, Cordelia fired back. She expected her dad to yell at her, but instead he just sighed again. He stood up slowly, wincing, as though even his bones hurt. We all grow up, Cordelia, he said in a strange voice. The world changes. We have to change along with it. She knew he was talking about more than her fight with Henry Haddock, but before she could ask him to explain, he was walking again. The wind sounded like distant voices, howling and whispering and sighing by turns, and the rain felt like a fine spray of glass against Cordelia's skin. At one point, she was sure she heard footsteps behind her and turned, hefting her lantern. A man with glittering shark eyes, a sharp beak of a nose, and neatly parted hair was moving through the mist. Cordelia started to call out to her father, but the man turned down a bend in the path and was gone. Cornelius Clay was unusually quiet. Normally, when they were on the trail of a monster, he told Cordelia stories about the world when it was young, a time in the hills of Scotland, where Cornelius had lived until he was 12, had been packed so densely with werewolves it was death to go out after dark, when phoenix birds warmed their feathers by the high noon sun, when magic and monsters were everywhere. But now he responded to her questions with a grunt, or not at all. She wondered whether he was angry with her. For an hour they traveled in silence, their lanterns casting twin circles of light on the rough and rocky ground ahead of them. Cordelia was aware of the faint fizzing sound of the rain against the hills, and of the rustling of the underbrush as unseen animals scurried about their business. She was aware, too, of the smells on the air, wet grass and rotting leaves, and the smell of her father, like lint and tobacco. Cordelia's father had taught her long ago that monsters, who liked the dark and knew all about skulking in the shadows, could be identified not just by sight, but by sound and even by smell. The Mordrum smelled a little bit like burnt toast. The Filches let out rumbling farts that smelled like rotten eggs. Cordelia had once found a diggle caught in a ditch, its hind leg twisted at a hopeless angle, because of the sudden and overwhelming smell of freshly baked gingerbread cookies, which was why, when halfway around the foothills that rose like gentle waves towards the moon, Cordelia smelled the faintest wisp of acrid smoke on the wind, and she knew they had found their dragon. Her father was walking ahead of her, head bent, lost in thought. "Dad," she started to call him back to her, but she didn't finish her sentence. Just then, a large tangle of briars at her left elbow burst into lively flame, and Cordelia was knocked backwards by a sudden whoosh of air. Chapter 2. Cordelia didn't even register hitting the ground before she was rolling away from the still crackling flames, moving by instinct. "Cordelia!" Her father was running down the path towards her, sliding a little on the slope. She fumbled in her rucksack for her goggles and the nubby, thick gloves made of fire-retardant material, which her father had made for her. Stupid had been caught without them. She slipped on the goggles and then the gloves, just as her father reached her. "Are you all right?" He pulled her to her feet. She nodded shakily. "I'm all right." The fire, which had burned hot in a sudden explosion of blue and pink flames, was already shriveling. As the briars turned black and curled into smoking nothing, the flames withered and died, leaving the air heavy with the smell of bitter smoke. "Stay back," he commanded her. He pushed into the thick tangle of growth, parting hedges and yew branches with his gloved hands, his lantern swinging. But Cordelia took a deep breath and plunged after him. It was even darker once they were off the path, and the moon, barely peeking through the storm clouds, was eclipsed by tall, overgrown sycamores and tangles of vines. "Where are you?" Cornelius muttered, as though in response. There was a low hiss from just ahead, and suddenly the scene was lit up as another low-hanging bush burst into flame. Cordelia caught a quick glimpse of a pair of glittering eyes and felt her stomach drop. A dragon. Then the eyes were gone, and her father was frantically clapping out the fire before it could spread. Cordelia saw a sudden movement to her right, a flicker, a slight shifting of the undergrowth. "Cordelia!" her father cried, but she ignored him, parting a curtain of hanging vine, ducking under a magnolia branch. Her heart was pounding so hard it was a constant thrum. A dragon! A dragon! A dragon! A twig snapped. She froze, listening. The wind lifted in the trees, carrying with it the sound of her father's urgent whispers. "Cordelia, get back here. Wait for me." And the smell of singed bark and leaves. Nothing else stirred. The dragon had once again faded into the darkness. Just then her father plunged through the growth behind her, panting, a streak of ash painted from cheek to chin. "Do you want to get yourself killed? Dragons are very aggressive. If we don't approach carefully, we'll end up roasted like. Look out, Dad!" This time Cordelia had seen the first spark, the two winking eyes. She hurled herself at her father, knocking him out of the way, just in time. They rolled several feet, crashing through a mulberry bush as another portion of the forest turned to flame. Cornelius lost his head strap to a clutch of bushes. His lantern went out with a faint twinkle of shattered glass. Cordelia's goggles were knocked off her head, and she landed with her nose planted directly in a soft pile of dirt. She sat up, sneezing, and came nose to snout with a wrinkled, wizened face of a dragon. A very, very small dragon. It was roughly the size of a kitten. Its wings, when fully extended, were the size of an eagle's, but full of leathery folds, collapsible as a paper fan. In the illumination of the flames, reaching for desperate purchase across wet and leafless winter branches, its eyes were the color of polished moonstone, and when it opened its mouth, Cordelia could see a row of small, sharp teeth, some of them no bigger than a pencil tip. It's a baby, she said, wonderingly. The dragon drew back its gums as though it was trying to smile. A rough hand seized Cordelia by the collar and jerked her to her feet as the dragon released another burst of flame, incinerating the spot where her nose had been only a second earlier. Baby, yes, her father said. His goggles were hanging crookedly from his nose. Harmless, no. Did you bring the tuber root? Cordelia nodded. Her cheeks felt hot, as if she'd received a bad sunburn. The dragon hopped back a few feet, hissing, and passing out of the small square of moonlight that filtered in through the trees. The storm was finally passing. Now Cordelia could barely make out the soft thrush of its wings dragging along the ground. One of them Cordelia saw was hanging. One of them Cordelia saw was hanging crookedly, obviously hurt. Cornelius touched a finger to his nose and then pointed to the left. Cordelia nodded again to show she understood and watched him slip off into the darkness in a rustle of leaves. She had never understood how her father could move so quietly. Soon he was nothing but a shadow. Cordelia fumbled in her bag for the tuber root, a favorite among dragons, especially growing ones, but could feel nothing in her thick gloves. She hesitated for a second. Take the gloves off, and she risked having her fingers turn to toasted marshmallows. But time was running out. If the dragon passed into the shadows again, they might lose it. She shook off her gloves, letting them fall into her rucksack, and almost immediately her fingers closed around the narrow jar of tuber root. She popped the lid with one hand and shook a bit of the dark, flaky substance into her palm. The dragon hadn't moved. She could still see it, just barely, its wings fanned across the carpet of leaves and mud. She could hear the whisper of its breathing when it inhaled. Faint curlicues of smoke emerged from its nostrils. She didn't know where her father was. She took a careful step forward, and the dragon scuttled backward, baring its teeth again. Cordelia hesitated, one hand extended. It's all right, she whispered, even though she knew the dragon couldn't understand. I'm here to help you. Slowly, slowly, so slowly, she felt as if she were sinking through a heavy vat of molasses. She lowered into a crouch. The fires were smoldering now into bare embers. The dragon's dark eyes watched her, reflecting the miniature swell of the nearly full moon. Now Cordelia's bare hand was only 6 inches from the dragon's nostrils, close enough to be burned, close enough to be smelled. The dragon advanced an inch, so that once again the moonlight fell over the ridged peaks of its long snout, over the hard knob of skin between its eyes, over its velvet dark nostrils, quivering slightly. Come on, Cordelia thought. Another inch. Now the dragon's snout was only a centimeter away from her fingertips. Her pulse was going crazy. It could take her hand off in one gulp, or fry her like bacon. She felt the electric heat of its breath every time it exhaled, and had to force herself to stay still, to stay calm. Where was her father? What was he doing? Suddenly the dragon moved, and Cordelia nearly fell backwards, yelping in surprise. At the last second, just as the dragon nudged its head into her hand, she managed to right herself. At a slight nod from Cordelia, It hungrily gobbled the tuber root from her hand, avoiding nipping her skin. Cordelia wanted to laugh out loud. Her blood was singing. A baby dragon was eating from her palm, its jaw working against her fingers, its hot breath stinging her skin. The dragon smelled like damp leather and fresh wind and fire. "That's a good boy," she whispered. Up close, she could see the small knob at the back of its head that distinguished it as a male. She noted the tear in its left wing fold, and a place where the bone looked crooked. She felt a surge of pity for the monster. Who knew how long it had been earthbound, or when it had last eaten? She hoped that it had not yet developed a taste for human fingers. Cornelius appeared behind her. He kneeled to slip a large muzzle over the dragon's snout. "Gotcha!" Instantly, the dragon went still. The muzzle, secured in place by means of several leather straps, and made of the same fire-resistant material as Cordelia's gloves, included soft leather blinders meant to impair its vision. Dragons were extremely dependent on their eyes, and easily confused without the use of them. The constant flow of flames through their nostrils meant that their sense of smell was practically negligible, and their ears were comparatively small and unreliable. That was why Digbert had been so miserable when his eyes began to fail. For a moment, both Cordelia and her father sat there over the now subdued dragon, breathing hard. At last, Cordelia's heartbeat began to normalize. A sense of wonder invaded her whole body. The dragon had touched her. It had licked her. Cornelius removed his goggles, resting them on the top of his head, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his palm. "All right, Cordelia, fetch your lantern. Let's see what's what." She stood up and hurried back the way she had come. Her knees were wet, and the wind reached cold fingers down her back, but she barely felt it. She was full of a profound joy, love for her father, love for the shadows in the forest, love for all the strange and wild things that lived there. She found her lantern lying in the dirt where she had dropped it. She soon managed to get the wick lit and returned to kneel at her father's side. Let's see," Dr. Clay murmured, as he did a careful visual inspection of the dragon for injuries. The lantern illuminated delicate colors threaded through the dragon's wings, seams of gold and purple and blue and green. "The dingle clips won't do. Put them back in my bag, will you, Cordelia? Looks like the femur is broken. Poor creature. And see where the membrane has ripped away? I don't want to worsen the tear." He was all business now. He indicated the injury with the tip of a pencil, tracing the outline of the wing in the air, and Cordelia tried to absorb and memorize everything. "He'll need stitches, too, but that will have to wait. A split might work, but I'm concerned the trauma is too deep." He frowned, obviously deep in thought. Then, rousing himself, he replaced the pencil in his jacket pocket. "Better to be safe than sorry, Cordelia. Get the rig-a-wings from my rucksack, will you? The smaller size should do it." Once again, Cordelia hurried to obey. How often had she knelt with her father in the thick darkness, tending to a sick or injured monster? How often had he called her to his side, or ordered her to fetch bone splints and cough drops, heart pumps and tentacle creams? Countless times. Measuring tablets and tinctures, patching wounds, selecting instruments, sweating in the darkness. All of it was familiar to her, as familiar as the sound of her father's footsteps or the smell of her mother's perfume, which she could still perfectly recall. And yet, for a moment, kneeling beside her father's rucksack, digging through the jumble of tools and medicines, she was assailed with a certainty as sudden as fear. This was the last time. the very last time that she and her father would ever save a monster. I will stop there. So that was the first chapter and a half of our book for the week, which was The Magnificent Monsters of Cedar Street by Lauren Oliver. So if you're interested in finding out what happens, we have this book at the library. So stop by and check it out. So thank you for joining me today for Story Starters, and I hope you enjoyed the story. Bye.